My name is Maggie Torres. Folks in our valley used to call me Grandma Maggie or Maggie of the Vines. I'm 71 now, and I live in a shoebox of an apartment that looks over the ocean, pretty view, if you can forget how I got it. But the view don't come with the peace that picture postcard sunsets promise. That view reminds me, every single evening when the light hits the water and throws gold across my hands, that people will build a nice facade on top of other folks' lives and call it progress. I was born here, in California wine country, cinders still in the creek, the old winery on the hill that smelled like yeast and sunlight. My father planted the first handful of vines, and his hands taught me how the dirt remembers. Wine isn't made in a day and sure as hell isn't made by greed, it's patience and sweat and small miracles. I married young, raised a daughter named Rosa between harvests and winters, and the vineyard became our life and our pride. We hosted harvest dinners under string lights, men came with trucks and laughter and left singing. I shelled out pies and patched shirts and watched the place grow from a family field into a label people recognized at markets 3 towns over. People would say, Maggie's grapes made that vintage sing. I'd smile, mop my flour-dusted hands, and say, it's the land. We just listened to it. My daughter Rosa fell in love with a man named Alan. He was not from here, he came from a city of glass and suits, but he had a way with promises and a smile that looked like opportunity. He complimented the way our vineyard caught the fog at dawn. He said he admired what we'd built. He came on weekends at first, then started staying longer, talking about irrigation systems, about efficiencies, about increasing yield. He wore a watch that cost more than my monthly water bill and brought me coffee from cafes with names that sounded like poems. You know the kind, he always had plans. And one day, he told me while we shelled peas on the back porch, we could make this land do even more. There's money out there. I listened while the peas dropped into a bowl. I was old enough to know that plans can be bright and full of heat, and sometimes they do good. But plans are not the same as roots. Plans don't kneel in mud. Plans don't smell like fermenting grapes in August. Plans are sometimes the first thing that cuts you loose. Rosa was dazzled by him. She said, Mama, he sees the future. She wanted to believe that the future was a bigger house and a condo for guests, and maybe she wasn't wrong, some changes can be sweet. But there are roads you pave by flattening other people's gardens. I should have watched him closer. I should have listened when neighbors called him slick. But a mother loves her child's happiness in a way that makes you blink, and I blinked until the edges blurred. Alan came around more and more. He started going to council meetings and speaking of development like an evangelist. He said our valley deserved jobs, more people, prosperity. He bought us fancy dinners, told stories about investors in San Francisco who could turn a hillside into gold. He praised the soil, and then he complimented our bookkeeping. He'd ask questions about the title, about zoning. Just in case, he'd say. You know how these things go. It's good to be prepared. I trusted Rosa with the paper. She'd always been better with numbers, better with phones and forms. She and Alan would sit for hours in our little kitchen, the lamp on and the kids asleep, his laptop open, fingers flying. They said it was research. Sometimes he took her out to dinner and told her things about future investments and retirement security. I watched them and felt both pride and a small, steady unease that I could never name at the time. I told myself mothers are allowed to be wrong sometimes, that the heart wants what it wants. The first time I felt a chill was the day the sign went up. It was a simple blue placard, a developer's permit nailed to a post by the road. It said in official black letters, subdivision proposal, coastal residences development, conceptual. People stopped like they were hearing a rumor about someone's funeral. It didn't say Vineyard or Heritage. It said development. Rosa came downstairs with flour on her fingers and above her eyes a stiffness I'd rarely seen. Alan gave me a kiss on the cheek and said, "We're exploring options, Mama. No decisions yet." His hands smelled of cologne. He put the placard in the trunk of his car like it was nothing. Then the town meeting started. Alan stood at the podium and spoke with the smooth cadence of a man who had a slide deck and people who would clap. He talked about opportunity, housing needs, a vision. He showed renderings, glass boxes on the hill where our vines once tangled and slept. He called it progress, the renderings called it neat lines and money. I sat in the back, shoulders hunched, watching my daughter's hand on his arm. People asked questions. Some nodded. The developer had an accent of persuasion. A few old-timers, men who'd worked the soil with shovels and stubbornness, shook their heads, but the mayor smiled politely and asked for further discussion. I remember thinking that if this was a play, I would have missed the cue to throw a chair. But life is not a play with cues, and the only thing to do is stand and wait and keep your hands working. I kept my hands working, mending nets, picking grapes, talking to the vines like they were old friends. Secret meetings happened. Alan met with surveyors on early mornings when the fog still lay heavy. He signed what he said were non-binding letters of intent. He told Rosa to trust him. "We'll do right by this land," he said in the way men with plans sometimes use truth as decoration. I started to find emails printed and left on the counter, contracts with long pages of legal words. I could have read them, but I trusted my daughter, and I let the pages stack like dead leaves. One winter we came to know the buyer. A company from out of state, slick, polished, with logos someone designed to make you feel secure, offered a figure that made tongues wag and heads calculate in grocery store language. "It'll secure your family for generations," Alan told Rosa, and he said it so tenderly that she cried. She'd been working nights on the books and mornings in the fields. She was tired. And who am I to argue with a payoff that promises peace? But you learn, too late sometimes, that peace bought in one place might cost you everything in another. A week after the sale, I stood in the kitchen listening to the radio while the kettle sang. It was just a sound, that little whistle. The phone rang. Rosa answered, voice thin but bright. "Mama," she said, and in her voice was the lift of someone who'd been handed a ticket. "They'll be here to close next Thursday." Close? Close what? I felt it then, like a small earthquake under my feet, a tremor of finality that settled into the bones. I asked to see the papers. She put them in my hands, signed and stamped. It all looked official. There were signatures. There was a check, fat and clean, dropped into our account like a summer rain. The last harvest I worked on that land, I planted seeds by hand and watched the rows as if they might vanish like a trick. The buyers arrived with cameras, hard hats, and enthusiasm that smelled like sawdust. They took photos of our terraces, of the creek that laced through the field. They nodded to Alan as if he were the steward, and when he explained how they'd preserve some of the vines for a boutique label and call it Heritage, I felt like laughing and crying at once. Heritage, they said. As if slapping a name on the leftovers makes theft into charity. I did what my mother taught me. I packed the preserves, labeled the jars, and handed out thank you pies the way you hand out condolences. I did the neighborly thing even though my throat felt raw. Rosa hugged me and said, "Look, Mama, we can move to a condo that's got ocean views." Ocean views we could not possibly afford without the house that sat over 3 generations of mortgages paid and promises kept. I wanted to say that the vineyard was not an asset on a spreadsheet, it lived. It breathed and bled and tasted like the people who picked it. But Rosa's fingers tightened and the word security tasted so sweet in her mouth I swallowed mine. The week after closing, movers came with boxes and polite hands. I packed my jars and my apron and a framed photo of my father with soil on his knuckles. The buyer's representative, an earnest man with a face like a brochure, handed me a check for a small moving allowance and a list of contractors. They'd arranged temporary housing while the ground was prepared. I signed papers about relocation assistance. They called it generous. It felt like theft with a smile. They put us in a tiny apartment in a building with glass that caught the morning like a net. The view was ocean, yes, blue and big and terrible. It cost every cent of our moving money and then some. The windows were nice, but the apartment did not hold the smell of fermentation or the chorus of frogs in the creek or the network of neighborly gossip. It held only echo. On the first night, I stood on the small balcony and watched the lights of the developers' trucks on the hill, cranes like sleeping dinosaurs flexing their necks. I remember thinking, quite calmly, that this was the moment I would have to decide what kind of woman I would be after the land was gone. Would I fade? Would I scream? Would I do what women like me have to do in the quiet? If you're still here, sweet soul, go ahead and like this video because there's a part coming next you're not gonna want to miss. It's the part where I first smell the rot under the paint. The first hint wasn't the moving truck or the renderings. It was a letter I found tucked behind a stack of receipts in Alan's coat pocket when I went to hang it up. It was an aside, a note from an attorney, saying that certain parcels were rezoned and that some easements would render future claims less likely. Legal words you hear and let slide because you trust your child. But the note had a second line I still see when I close my eyes. Title may be cleared if current lease pendens removed. Lease pendens, lawsuits pending, do you know what that is? It's the kind of word that's supposed to protect people when a developer comes with bulldozers and big promises. And the note said someone would make that problem go away. For a fee. For favors. For signatures that are cleverer than honesty. I don't want to scare you with legal jargon, but know this, people with plans will hire folks to make trouble disappear. They call it due diligence. I call it erasure. Rosa was too busy signing off the color choices for the show homes to notice I'd been reading Alan's mail. She'd been wooed by the idea of leaving the hard work behind. I don't blame her for wanting ease. I blame her for not looking at the ledger. So I sat with the note and I folded it inside my apron and let it sit there like a seed. That night, when the apartment hummed with cheap air conditioning, I stared at the map of our valley and felt something in me go from hurt to a slow, determined heat. I had been given a view, all right, the ocean, but I had also been given a reason. By dawn I'd made a promise to myself. I was not going to be the kind of woman who let her history be sold like a coffee mug. I had hands that learned work from the ground. That was my advantage. I would make them remember the people who put down the roots. I would make them answer for what they'd done. And I would do it in a way that made them wish they'd never decided the Vineyard would make good condos. I remember the first time I really understood that Alan wasn't the man I, or Rosa, thought he was. It wasn't a whisper or a rumor. It was a stack of papers that smelled like printer ink and greed, left carelessly in his briefcase when he went to a meeting in San Francisco. I didn't open it at first. I couldn't. The room felt too small, too quiet. The walls of our apartment held the ocean light, but even that couldn't soften the cold that crept into my bones. Then curiosity won. I slid the briefcase open and saw it, contracts, bank statements, emails between him and lawyers who had names I didn't recognize but whose signatures were tight and precise. I could feel every beat of my heart in my ears. He had been moving money, parcels, and signatures like chess pieces while Rosa and I were busy with harvests and kitchen chores. The first document made my hands shake, a letter from a shell company in Nevada, referencing payments for facilitation of property rights. Facilitation of property rights. That's lawyer talk for stealing someone's life under the guise of legality. And I realized then that the check we had received for our vineyard was only part of the story. The real story, the hidden story, was elsewhere, in accounts Alan had set up, in easements and zoning changes that bypassed my name entirely. I called Rosa, voice shaking. "Did you know about these accounts?" I asked. Her reply was the kind of hesitation that cuts you deeper than lies. "Mama, I thought Alan was taking care of it. He said it was for the future." Her words trailed off, and I could hear the tremor in her hands as she held the phone. I wanted to tell her to look at the papers herself, but I also knew she'd be too shocked, maybe even broken. I had to do it alone first. Night after night, I stayed at that small apartment table, magnifying glass and ledger in hand, tracing his handwriting, comparing signatures. Every forged line, every shadow of a stamp that didn't belong, became a puzzle piece. Alan had been thorough. Too thorough. And clever. But clever isn't always enough when the truth is stubborn, and I had patience. The more I found, the more I realized that this wasn't just about condos or money. It was about erasing me, erasing our family from the land we had built from dirt and dreams. I found emails where he discussed zoning loopholes that would prevent us from contesting the changes. He had talked to contractors and city officials about quick sales and future-proofing profits. My vineyard was a canvas, and he was painting over it without even cleaning the brush. The betrayal hit hardest when I found the correspondence between Alan and one of Rosa's former teachers, someone who had trusted him. He'd been using that relationship to add credibility, to make others believe that transforming our land was for the community's benefit. And my own daughter, who I had raised to trust and question, had unknowingly become a part of the scheme. I didn't yell. I didn't storm out. I sat in the apartment, staring at the ocean, feeling the weight of every vine, every harvest dinner, every hand that had ever worked that land. And then I made a quiet promise. I would uncover every single deceit. I would trace every account, every signature, every promise Alan had broken. And when I did, I would make sure that he could not hide from the consequences. The next day, I started with the small things. A neighbor who had always been quiet, almost invisible during the meetings, mentioned seeing Alan meeting with city officials in private, late at night. Another neighbor recalled a meeting in a cafe, where Alan had been taking care of the paperwork in a way that seemed secretive even to someone who didn't know the law. Each piece, each memory, was another thread I could pull. I also discovered that Alan had started selling off parcels of the vineyard before the official sale even went through. They were tiny sections, almost imperceptible to the casual eye, but they were worth thousands. And the buyers were out-of-state investors who didn't know, or care, about the history of the land. Every time he thought he had hidden a transaction, I found a way to trace it. It was during one of these nights, hunched over documents with the ocean light fading behind me, that I found the note that changed everything, an email from Alan to a development company, referencing Rosa by name in a way that suggested she had consented to sell land that legally belonged to me. That's when I realized Rosa hadn't fully known. She had trusted Alan. And Alan had used her trust as a weapon against me. I felt rage, sure. But I also felt something else, clarity. For the first time since the apartment, since the move, I saw a path. He thought he had erased us. He thought he had rewritten our family's story on his terms. But every move he made left a trace. And I intended to follow every trace to its end. Before I could plan, I needed more proof. Cameras, receipts, witnesses, anything to ensure that when the time came, no one could say it was just a mother's anger. I reached out to old friends in the wine community, people who had seen contracts, deliveries, and conversations. Some were hesitant. Some were scared. But when I explained the situation, their eyes widened. They had suspected Alan was up to something, but no one had dared to speak. Now, I had them. And then came the night I stumbled upon the folder he'd left on our kitchen counter, just a folder he must have forgotten in the chaos of moving boxes. Inside were drawings, contracts, and a ledger of every condo unit sold or planned, with projected profits calculated down to the penny. I looked at it and whispered to myself, "You thought you could hide from me." The more I saw, the more I understood. This was bigger than greed. This was about control. About rewriting a legacy. About turning generations of sweat into profit for one man who called himself family. And that's when I made my next quiet promise. I would make sure every deceit, every lie, every act of betrayal would be exposed. I would make Alan remember the vines, the land, and the people he had tried to erase. So I sat there that night, the ocean's breeze brushing the curtain, and began to plan. I slept very little the nights that followed. When you've spent your life listening to the land, how it breathes, when it needs water, when frost might bite, you develop a patience that's more like a muscle than a virtue. That patience was what kept me moving through those first weeks of discovery. I felt like a woman who had just found a loose brick in a house she thought was solid. You don't yank the whole wall down at once. You pry, you listen to the moan, and you pull out the pieces carefully so the structure comes down on evidence, not on the force of your fury. It hurt to realize that Rosa had been used. She looked at me the first time I showed her the folder and saw the ledger and went as pale as flour. "Mama," she whispered, like someone speaking to a ghost, "I didn't know." She held my hand and squeezed it until I felt her bones. I wanted to shake her and tell her it didn't matter, until it did. That ache in my chest was complicated. There was betrayal and there was love braided together. I had to keep both, because one would fuel me and the other would save me from becoming cruel. I called an old lawyer, a man named Hernandez who used to help small farmers when banks tried to swallow them whole. He had a face like old leather and hands that didn't flinch when you handed them bad news. I took the folder to his office, sat in a chair that smelled like coffee, and let him read. He did not look up until the last page. Then he put the papers down and said, "Maggie, you've got a lot more here than a grudge. You've got paper trails. This isn't just a bad son-in-law. This is organized, people who thought they could retitle what you built without consequence." He nodded slowly. "We'll start with a claim of fraud and a petition to the court to rescind the sale on the grounds of misrepresentation." When a lawyer who's seen too many county courthouse lobbies says the word fraud, you remember that the law can work like a plow, slow, but it can turn the ground. Knowing this gave me a small kind of power. It's different, sweet, and dangerous, to be the person who holds proof in your pocket. You can move people. You can make them nervous. But legal action is dry and slow and it doesn't feed your heart at night. So I did two things at once. I started gathering witnesses and I started sowing doubts in other places. If Alan had thought he could purchase complacency with a check, he had forgotten that a town remembers its tales. People may not care about an accountant's ledger at first, but they care about fairness and they care about the texture of things. I began to tell the story, gently, to friends who had seen him act late, to the barter club at the feed store, to women at the co-op. I didn't shout accusations, I handed out questions like crumbs. "Do you remember who signed that easement? Which official was at that meeting?" Questions make people check their own memories. At the same time, I engineered small, perfectly legal inconveniences that would make the people upstream of Alan uncomfortable. I filed a complaint with the County Planning Commission about the environmental assessment. I sent a certified letter to the local historical society asking whether any of the parcels had significance that should give the community a say. Old vineyards, as I learned from the archivist, can sometimes be protected under local heritage ordinances if they've been farmed continuously for generations. That required proof, deeds, affidavits, photos, and I had all of those in the folder under my bed. When you pack a place in paperwork, you arm yourself in a way that feels practical and righteous. One afternoon, over coffee in a cracked mug that had been in my mother's cupboard, I met with Mr. Alvarez, my next-door neighbor who had spent his life pruning my elder vines when my hands were weak. He was a man who didn't speak much, but when he did, people listened. I showed him a page from Alan's ledger, a note about quiet processing and a phone number. He tapped the ledger with a calloused finger and said, "He met with that city planner at midnight, Maggie." Folks saw the truck. He didn't want to be the first to talk, but he agreed to sign an affidavit saying he had witnessed surveyors on private land at odd hours. A signed, sworn statement from a neighbor carries weight in a courtroom in a way that gossip never will. I also made a small, perhaps cruel, but entirely legal decision. I went to the people Alan courted. I went to the developers who'd bought the lots, and I asked them small, sincere questions. Did Alan mention pending litigation? Did he present every document to you? Who vouched for the title? They were surprised. No one had asked that way, softly, with the insistence of a woman who would not be dismissed. One of them, a young investor who smelled like a new suit and old money, confessed that he had been told the title was clear. That language is the sort of blanket that fences you out. Once you get an investor to say that aloud, you start threading it through other ears. There was a moment I'll never forget. I walked into the chamber where the planning board held its meetings with a stack of photographs, leases, and the letter about the lease pendants I'd found in Alan's pocket. I spoke for 5 minutes. I didn't cry. I didn't yell. I used facts, dates, people, signatures. I asked questions that made them uncomfortable. Who approved easements for this parcel at midnight? Who authorized the change without notifying the heirs? A few heads turned red as people checked their notes. After the meeting, I watched officers of the board pull side documents and whisper. That whisper is how a city begins to worry. In late nights, when the apartment was quiet and the ocean painted black beyond the glass, I dreamed up softer tactics. I invited the women from the harvest dinners to a small tea in my apartment. I baked and I listened. People spoke of Alan's charm, of how he would always buy the best wine at club meetings, how he'd once donated to the church to seem generous. It became clear that he'd cultivated a social currency. The antidote to social currency is community memory, so I asked people to write down what they'd seen, odd truck visits, late meetings, the times Alan said one thing in public and another in private. Their short written recollections later became affidavits. There is a power in 100 small, honest words. I hired a private title researcher through Hernandez. That man walked through county records like a hound in the brush. He found things I couldn't, a chain of transfers that leaned on one another like dominoes and one missing signature that should have required a notary witness. He found a temporary easement filed the week before the sale, one that had been granted under suspicious circumstances. The researcher's reports were precise and patient and, most importantly, admissible. They were a legal scalpel. While the papers were coming together, I also arranged a quiet public pressure campaign, quiet, because I am not a vindictive woman by nature, and quiet because noise invites lawyers and I wanted truth, not spectacle. I wrote a letter to the editor of the local paper, a piece about the land and the lives built on it, about how harvest dinners are not just parties but ledger lines of memory and labor. I didn't mention names at first. I told the story of the vines and the people. The editor called me and asked if I'd be willing to expand. I said yes, but I told him I'd need to be careful. He promised discretion. He also promised that if the ledger documents checked out, the paper would run an investigative piece. The thought of the paper behind me made Alan move faster. You could see it. People do not like the idea that their names will be in print next to the word forgery. I grew clever in other, small ways. I learned to listen to the cadence of people's denials. When someone says, "I would never," you ask, "Would you sign your name that way?" And you hold the paper up. People trip over the little things. I asked unthreatening questions to the developer's publicists, to the assistant city planner, to the notary who'd signed one of the suspicious documents. I wasn't trying to trap them into lying. I was trying to see where the thread pulled taut. When you tug the right spot, things unravel. Everything I did was legal. I am not a petty criminal plotting a dramatic downfall. I am a woman who was patient with the law until the law was ready to listen. But patience alone would not have been enough. I used what the land had taught me, timing. You prune a vine at the right season so the fruit will come next year. You bring a question before a council meeting when the public is ready to listen. You bring evidence to an editor when the paper has space. Timing makes facts irresistible. People began to notice. Alan started to look differently at town events. He was more careful with who he met and where. I liked that because caution tells you more than bravado ever does. He began to make mistakes too. He double-posted a contract. He used the same odd email phrasing twice in different documents, and Hernandez's keen eye flagged it. The legal net tightened. But there was one other thing I did that I will admit to because it fits the story of a woman who had nothing left to lose. I called Rosa's friends and asked them to stop by the old vineyard one afternoon with cameras. We staged nothing. The vines were where they'd always been. What we wanted was footage of the land, of the terraces, of the small stone wall my father had built. When you show those images in a slideshow, aerial shots paired with photographs of the generations who worked there, people suddenly see what's being lost. The local TV segment ran, and I remember watching the footage with my hands clasped around a warm mug and feeling the town shift. People called the station, and then the developer's office. People asked questions. The investor I'd spoken with earlier began to call his peers. Quiet pressure builds into noise, and noise brings scrutiny. There were nights I worried I'd gone too far. I'd sit on the balcony of that small apartment, the ocean like glass below, and wonder if I'd lost myself in the hunt. But then I'd remember my father's hands in the dirt and the way he taught me to work until the soil answered. This was work too, different arms of it, but work with purpose. I wanted the truth known, not for spectacle, but so my granddaughter, one day, if Rosa had children, would know where she came from. The final piece of planning was to make sure there was a legal stay on any further development while our claims were being investigated. Hernandez filed a motion with the court seeking an injunction to halt construction until the dispute over title and alleged misrepresentation could be resolved. That gave us breathing room. You can't tear up a vineyard and call it condos if a judge has asked everyone to stop until that judge reads the paper. The day the injunction was filed, I felt both fear and a wicked kind of relief. It was a moment of consequence. Alan called that evening, his voice clipped, brittle. "Mom," Rosa began on speakerphone, and I heard the hesitated syllable, like something nodded. I didn't pick up that call to be gentle. I picked it up to say, plainly, "You started this. Now help us fix it." Her voice broke. Alan promised cooperation and said things about misunderstandings and the future. I listened and let his words pass like other people's prayers, and then I hung up. When I walked the old rows the next morning, the vines nodded as if they understood. The tractors were quiet. The cranes were stalled, their arms suspended like fingers mid-dig. The injunction had teeth. The town was watching. The developer's PR people began to spin softer messages about reconsideration and heritage parcels. That word, heritage, fell from their mouths as if they'd always meant it. But words without deeds are like wine without fermentation, hollow. The planning was done. The net was cast. I had used papers, friends, the law, the editors, and the town's love for its history. I had kept my hands clean but my heart fierce. I had not sought to humiliate, but I had to make sure that a man who had thought he could retitle someone else's life felt the inconvenience of attention. There was one last thing left to do before I moved from planning to action, and that is what I will tell you next, how I began to pull the threads that would make the deception undeniable not only to a judge but to everyone who had cheered for him. It's where the traps close and the truth comes out with the sound of pages slapping on a table. I slept poorly the night before everything began. Not because I was afraid, fear had been a constant companion for months, but because I'd grown used to waking at odd hours with the pieces of the puzzle turning in my head. The injunction had bought us time, the paper said stay and the cranes froze like tired birds waiting for permission to move. That pause is a dangerous thing for someone who wants to act. You either fill it with preparation or watch your chance evaporate. I chose to prepare. The first move was quiet and surgical. Hernandez had already subpoenaed bank records, Detective Morales had a warrant in his pocket, the developer's PR director was beginning to squirm. What none of them expected was how patient I could be, and how I could use patience like a scalpel. I'd been patient all my life. I knew when to wait for the frost to pass and when to prune a vine so the fruit would sweeten. That morning, I simply sat in the old office of the legal clinic and let them do their work while I called people. You want drama? The truth is often more dramatic than any staged finale. The first shock came via an email to the paper's investigative reporter. I had sent him the private ledger I'd found in Alan's briefcase, the one with lists of condos sold under shell company names and dates that matched transfers into Nevada accounts. I'd done it weeks earlier and let him sit with it. He had a nose for stories, and when he finally called to say he'd verified a string of transfers from our county to Nevada, I felt the ground give a little under my feet. He wanted to run a piece. He wanted names. I told him everything I could without spilling the endgame. When the story ran, it was small at first, a headline about questions raised over Vineyard sale. But in the valley, small things flare. The TV station picked it up. Neighbors called. The investor I'd spoken with began to ask the developer for more documents. And Alan, oh Alan, he reacted like a man who always expected the lights to bend in his favor. He went on television to defend himself with that smooth, practiced cadence. He said everything a guilty man says when he hopes charm will do the rest. These are complex transactions, and we followed all regulations. He smiled in the kind of way that had charmed my daughter. But smiles don't hold up to ledgers and subpoenas, and the lights make sweat. That's when the dominoes started to fall. Detective Morales, bless him, had subpoenaed the casino records first. The casino, despite its shiny veneer, keeps obsessive paperwork, times, chips, payout slips, the faces of people who cash out big. When the casino produced the logs, they showed my son-in-law at tables at times that matched when my ring disappeared, when the pawn shop recorded a sale, and when deposits were made into accounts bearing my forged name. Seeing those slips for the first time felt like watching someone stitch a hiding place and then stand in the doorway with the cloth still in their hands. I had proof that linked behavior to action. It was clinical and devastating. But the legal proofs were only one blade of the plan. The other was social, and sometimes social pressure cuts deeper. I convened a small meeting at the community center under the pretext of a harvest potluck for heritage growers. I invited the paper's reporter, a couple of neighbors who'd seen surveyors late at night, the pawn shop owner, Mr. Lyle, and one of the developers who had begun to realize he bought something that might be a legal mess. I sat at the head of the table, small, quiet, and steady, and told the story without drama, only facts. I laid out the ledger prints, the pawnshop logs, and parts of the casino record that showed timing. People listened like they were at a revival. The room felt full of the kind of moral gravity that makes men rethink their alliances. That night, a phone call leaked from someone on the developer's side, an investor who had been sold a clear title but found, after talking with my lawyer, that the title wasn't as clear as promised. He was livid. He called the developer and recorded the conversation where the developer said, "We'll handle the lien quietly." That single recorded sentence, caught on the investor's phone, became the most damning thing Alan's team did not expect. I played that recording for the reporter. He put it on the radio. There's nothing quite like hearing a developer admit to handling a legal problem in a tone that assumes corruption is just part of business. The town's hair stood up. Next came the pawn shop. I owe Mr. Lyle a lot for what he did that day. He'd been embarrassed and angry when I brought the pawn slips and told him the ring was mine. He called all his contacts and found the item in a warehouse 2 counties over. He'd been paid in cash. The man who'd sold it to the pawn shop had used a fake ID. When the detective came with a search warrant, they found the boxing slips and a paper trail that led back to a courier company used by the shell accounts. Each link was a stitch in a chain. You pull a stitch and the whole thing unravels. Alan tried to fight back publicly. He hired a high-powered lawyer and tried to question the chain of custody of my documents. He claimed I'd planted evidence. People who don't know what real hardship looks like will always spin that lie. She's bitter, she's fabricating. But the more he protested, the more suspicious he looked. Confidence becomes overconfidence when the facts are against you. And the facts were against him. There were surprises I hadn't planned for. Rosa, my girl, started to see things not as a daughter who wants comfort but as someone who had been lied to. I watched the change like I watch grapes ripen. It was inevitable and painfully beautiful. She went to Alan and asked straight questions. She demanded to see bank statements and the contracts he had signed supposedly on her behalf. And when she saw his handwriting matched one of the signature forgeries, she dropped like a cut fruit. She sat on the kitchen floor, surrounded by papers, and looked at me with a new face. "Why didn't I see it?" she asked. I put my hand on her head like a hat and said, "You saw what you trusted to see. Now we know." One of the sharpest turns came when Hernandez filed a motion to rescind the sale on grounds of misrepresentation and undue influence. That brought a judge into the story, and judges, bless them, like their paper neat and their facts straight. We presented affidavits, ledgers, photos of late-night surveys, the investor's recorded confession, pawn slips, and one crucial piece, an email thread where Alan coordinated with a county clerk who later denied conversation on tape. The clerk did not take kindly to being named in a case like that. Under oath, with the paper evidence in front of them, people began to stumble. There was one day when the developer's lawyers realized the construction loan they'd put on one of the parcels had been issued to an account that matched the shell company Alan used for facilitation. They froze the loan and demanded an audit. The building permits were set to be revoked if the lien holders decided the title wasn't clear. The cranes, remember those cranes, sat idle like sentinels of a stalled empire. Contractors who had been promised work started calling the developer to ask about payment. Money talks, and when money is uncertain, people scatter. If you think this sounds like gloat, understand, I did not celebrate the pain it caused. I watched men I had once admired squirm. I watched neighbors who had cheered the promise of jobs blink when I read aloud the ledger. I felt a complicated mixture of sorrow and something like relief. The Vines had been quiet witnesses through all of this, and I imagine they felt it too, some kind of justice carried on the wind. Then came the most cinematic, and the most human, moment. The planning committee for the new development had scheduled a public open house. Alan was planning to show the model homes and talk about community benefits. I arranged for us to attend, neighbors, the paper, the TV crew, and one quiet, eloquent woman from the Historical Society who had seen deeds issued to my family from the 1920s. When the crowd gathered and Alan began his speech, the reporter had scheduled his follow-up interview. I sat in the crowd, my hands folded, and listened to Alan speak about progress. Then the reporter played the investor's recorded call over the public address system. The hush that fell afterward was heavy enough to taste. People shifted. The developer's smile cracked like a glaze on pottery. Alan tried to speak. He said, "It's complicated." And then from the crowd, my neighbor Mr. Alvarez, the man who had pruned my vines for 40 years, someone asked the quietest question I'd ever heard. "Did you ever ask the people who planted these vines what they wanted?" The question landed like a stone dropped in a quiet pool. People murmured. Somebody else asked about the late-night surveyors. The TV cameras cut to a shot of faces, neighbors, the elderly, kids who'd grown up under string lights, and you could see in the composition of that image the thing developers forget, a community. The legal machinery kept grinding, depositions, affidavits, the judge's patience wearing thin. Alan panicked in private. He made calls I will not repeat in detail, but one of those calls did not go to a friend, it went to a man who owed him favors. That man, when pressed by Detective Morales, turned state's evidence rather than swim with a sinking ship. He gave a sworn statement that connected a courier to a P.O. box to a Nevada account. With that, the prosecutor had enough to file charges for wire fraud and forgery. Those are ugly words that carry heavy weight. The county sheriff served papers. My hands, which had once pruned vines, shook when I signed to testify. It is a strange thing to be both accuser and witness, but it is also strangely empowering. On the day the arrests were made, I felt a strange hush. There was no mob outside. There was no cheering. There was the calm that follows a large storm. Alan was taken into custody. His face, once so polished, had lost the sheen. I watched him step into the squad car and felt the vine's memory unfurl in my chest. Justice is not a thunderbolt. It is a paperwork storm in a sequence of small, honest steps. What followed was not simply legal retribution, it was the slow work of repair. The judge rescinded parts of the sale pending a full accounting. Some of the parcels reverted, and a receiver was appointed to manage the property. The investors, embarrassed and legally exposed, sued the developer. Contracts were voided where misrepresentation was proven. The company's stocks, no, it was not a huge corporation, but smaller investors are sensitive to scandal, wobbled. The PR director who had once polished Alan's speeches suddenly found his skills in short supply. But there was something more intimate that happened as well. In court, when the ledger was read and the pawn slips were displayed, Rosa looked at me with a face that had finally learned. She stood and apologized, publicly, to me and to the valley. The apology was not a theatrical thing, it was a small, cracked sound, the kind only truth can make. She promised to work with the community to restore what was lost. We forged a plan, literally we sat and drafted. We asked the county to create a community land trust for part of the vineyard so small growers could remain. The judge liked the idea. It was messy and imperfect and a little bit beautiful. There were shocks that I hadn't imagined. Alan, in a bid to salvage something, offered, through his lawyer, to buy back an easement in the name of the family and to fund the restoration of some vines. The offer came with strings. It was an attempt to wriggle free. Hernandez advised caution. It's a negotiation, he said. You do not sign away the rest because of one shiny offer. I listened. I remembered my father's hands and the smell of soil after rain, and I knew that nothing that cost your dignity was worth a contract, however gilded.